Cartmel, Priory Gatehouse, Cumbria. The vicinity of this Priory Gatehouse has long been regarded as haunted by some of the monks from Cartmel Priory who once acted as guides across the treacherous sands. Over the years, the quicksands and the fast incoming sea have claimed many victims. Either could trap an unwary traveler in minutes, and it is said the quicksands could engulf a horse and carriage in half an hour. Sometimes the bodies of the drowned would be recovered, and many graves in the little cemetery adjoining the Priory Church and in that of nearby Conishead bear witness to this fact. But many more victims were never recovered, and it may be these restless souls, as well as the specters of those who died trying to save them, that have haunted this place for centuries. Local people say that the sands are peopled with ghosts, and that when the wind is in a certain direction coming off the sea, the whole place seems to be alive with the cries of dying men and women. Imagination? Perhaps. But what of the phantom form that has been seen in the lanes about Cartmel Priory, especially in the vicinity of the Gatehouse, which has stood here for more than 5 centuries, so that the very stones must be saturated with memories? There are many stories of ghosts here. There is one that has been seen many times, the ghost of a middle-aged man dressed in double-breasted waistcoat, breeches, ankle boots, and a tall hat. He appears to be friendly enough, and then suddenly he is no longer there. He is just one of the ghosts that haunts the area of the old gatehouse at Cartmel. Charlecote Park, Stratford-upon-Avon, Warwickshire. The building of this fine house was begun in 1551 by Sir Thomas Lucy, whose family had lived at Charlecote since 1189. George, Duke of Northumberland, had become enamored of pretty Catherine Lucy, widow of Captain Lucy of the Royal House Guards, but she insisted on matrimony. Within a year, he had grown tired of her, and he and his brother, who was a young man who welcomed all kinds of adventures, put their heads together and decided to kidnap Catherine and deposit her in a convent on the continent. These two, both illegitimate sons of Charles II by Barbara Castlemaine, managed successfully to inveigle Catherine aboard a ship, and in due course took her to a convent in Ghent, where they also succeeded in persuading the Mother Superior to certify that Catherine had entered the convent voluntarily. In high glee at the outcome of their plan, the brothers returned to England, but Catherine was a young woman with determination and spirit, and she proved to be more than a match for the sly schemers. She escaped from the convent, made her way to London, and sought out her husband. Threatened with scandal, Northumberland came to terms. But one wonders what kind of life and how much happiness Catherine enjoyed thereafter. Could she, or some other unlucky Lucy, be the ghost? The ethereal figure of a girl has repeatedly been seen running down to the willow-shaded water and there disappearing, making no disturbance to the surface as the form sinks and is submerged. Could Shakespeare have seen this ghost himself? For there is a persistent legend that this is the place where he was inspired to write his lines on Ophelia's death. Some people even say that the sad ghost of the drowned girl still floats in her watery grave. Lady Fairfax Lucy is in no doubt about Charlecote having its haunted room, and she says, "Our wing is very much impregnated with a sense of the past. That is, with the 3 generations who lived in it since it was built in the 1830s. The green room is in the original part of the old house and had a door opening on to the minstrel's gallery, taken down in the 1870s, above the great hall, and still has a small room off it. I have myself been conscious of a pressure of people and an unidentifiable hubbub of voices when alone in the room. My daughter slept in the green room bed and confirmed this. She awakened in the night to find herself on the floor with a crowd milling around her. But at the same time, I have to say that others have slept there and heard nothing. But as Lady Fairfax Lucy so rightly says, ghosts are not to be commanded, and in my experience appear to the most unlikely people. In answer to my questions about Charlecote's ghosts, Lady Fairfax Lucy explains that this green room, a bedroom in the south wing, long reputed to be haunted, is now used by the Lucy family. The confused noise of raised voices in the little room, once used by the musicians, has been heard by people, including herself, and it sounds as if an argument is taking place, accompanied by violent actions. Lady Fairfax Lucy also tells me she heard from an old servant who had been with the family for 60 years that a footman who drowned himself is sometimes seen, a black figure standing by the waterfall. Chartwell, Westerham, Kent. In this delightful home for 40 years of Sir Winston Churchill, 1874 to 1965, sorry, that's not 40 years. I'm guessing that's his lifetime. In this delightful home for 40 years of Sir Winston Churchill, which is furnished much as it was during his lifetime, it is not surprising that something of the great man still seems to linger, and that his form has been seen on at least one occasion, as recounted in Churchill and Chartwell by Robin Fedden. Understandably, perhaps, the studio in the garden, where there are some of his paintings and where he spent many happy hours, is regarded as especially haunted. Against a large tapestry that once hung in the Belgian Parliament, there stands a white marble bust of Lady Randolph Churchill, an old leather armchair, and a damaged portrait. Sir Winston's only son, Randolph, has described how once, when copying this portrait, he clearly saw his dead father sitting in the leather armchair nearby, and furthermore, they had a long discussion of men and events and of the changes which had overtaken the world in more than half a century. Many visitors to Chartwell remark upon a somewhat disconcerting atmosphere, an intangible feeling that the dominant personality of the man who made Chartwell what it is today still lingers here. Chingle Hall, Goosnargh, near Preston, Lancashire. One of the best authenticated examples of a haunted house in England, so James Wentworth Day described Chingle Hall, a fascinatingly hidden house built in the form of a cross that lies at the end of a long drive. I have lost count of the number of times I've been there, for the place has an intriguing and puzzling atmosphere, and it does seem indisputable that ghostly forms have been seen and heard here many, many times. I remember the late Mrs. Margaret Howarth telling my wife and I unequivocally, "This house is undoubtedly haunted." And then she went on, "We hear ghostly footsteps constantly in some rooms and passages, and sometimes heavy footsteps walk over the bridge across the moat, through the old front door and across the hall. Once 8 people heard these footsteps. Door latches move, sometimes night after night, and then not for a while. Doors open by themselves. Dogs' hackles rise at something they can see and sense. Objects are moved, water appears from nowhere. Monk-like figures have been seen inside the house and in the garden. Once my brother and I watched a cloaked form for 15 minutes before it faded and finally disappeared. No, we were not afraid. Now I can't think why we weren't. But we never slept in that room afterwards. This charming 700-year-old house, tucked away at the end of its lane, is believed to have been the birthplace of one John Wall, a Franciscan priest, who was once of the last English Roman Catholic martyrs. Certainly Chingle belonged to the Wall family in 1585, and John was born in 1620. He was executed at Worcester, in 1679, and his head is said to have been conducted on a grand tour of the continent before being smuggled back to Chingle. Here it was either buried in the grounds or immured somewhere inside the house, where several secret hiding places have been discovered, and probably there are more yet to be found. The ghostly form of John Wall is thought to have been seen here many times, 300 years after his death elsewhere. A local chief superintendent of police and his wife, a former guide, Mrs. Howard's brother, Miss Anne Strickland, Fred Knowles, the manager of Chingle Hall, the Reverend Peter Travis, and scores of visitors, believers and skeptics alike, have all experienced odd and apparently inexplicable happenings. The cowled head of a monk once peered through a window, a pale face described to me as hardly human and surrounded by a dark cowl, which appeared for a moment and then vanished. A similar cowled form was seen in the garden. A visitor saw two figures dressed like monks and in the act of praying in a downstairs room. Figures that seemed to melt into the wall when they are approached. A little later, in the haunted priest room upstairs, the figure of a man with shoulder-length hair has been seen to walk past outside a window, yet the window is all of 12 feet from the ground. Another visitor met a greenish diffuse figure in the porch. As she stopped, the figure turned and walked back into the dining room and disappeared. It was here in the comfortable dining room with its 1,000-year-old beams, in front of a roaring log fire, that my wife and I were entertained to tea one afternoon in March 1977, and heard for the first time something of the strange experiences reported from this interesting old house. We heard about Mrs. Walmley, who received a violent push in the back while she was standing alone in the center of the lounge, about skeptical Mrs. Morby, who was frightened when she found the air around her suddenly become icy cold, and she had the distinct feeling that she was not alone and was in fact being watched. Not a pleasant feeling. About Mrs. Robinson, who heard footsteps ascend the stairs, followed by 3 raps from inside the priest's hole in the deserted room. About Mrs. McKay, who felt a wave of cold air sweep over her in the priest room, and watched in astonishment as some flowers lifted themselves out of a vase, and a table lamp and a picture shook without anyone being near them. About Mrs. Rigby having a cup of tea with Mrs. Howarth in the lounge, when they both saw an old wooden plaque shoot off the wall over the fireplace and land in the center of the room. Once a visitor and her young son looked back at Chingle Hall as they left after a visit and saw a human form looking out of the window of the priest room, a form they described as a white or light gray-robed figure. But when they turned their car headlights on the window, the form was still there, but appeared to be black or dense. Michael Bingham, a young New Zealander, once heard sounds like bricks being moved when he was in the priest room. The sounds seemed to originate in the area of the opened priest's hole, and when he peered inside, he told me he saw what appeared to be part of a human hand moving one of the bricks. As he watched, the hand froze and then disappeared. Michael spent hours attempting to record on tape the footsteps that he heard many times and to record on film the cowled figure he had glimpsed from time to time. He ran for us a recording of the heavy footsteps and a film showing a shadowy shape that he told us he had obtained after keeping out of sight in a room off the corridor and taking the film by remote control when he heard the footsteps. Many people, including the present manager, believe that the ghost at Chingle Hall is that of the blessed John Wall, and that there is nothing to be frightened of. He was in life a man of God, they will tell you. Why should his spirit worry us when he is dead? In May 1979, 2 Ghost Club members paid a preliminary visit with plans to spend some hours in the haunted priest room. They arrived about 7:30 p.m. and met Fred Knowles, who proceeded to show them around and finally left them alone in the priest room. After a couple of hours, both investigators began to feel very bored and frustrated. By the time that light had faded, it was very dark in the priest room, where no light was used. Without any warning, loud bangs and thuds sounded in the direction of the priest hole, and they seemed to move across the floor towards one of the investigators. And when the sounds were, or seemed to be, virtually under his feet and the floor actually vibrated, he moved across the room towards the other investigator. The violent bangs continued until they reached the window facing the chimney on the opposite side of the room, and there they ceased. Both investigators were very surprised after a long period of complete inactivity and the continuing noise of the owner's television downstairs. They had been lulled into thinking that nothing unusual would happen. The noise really was very loud, so loud that it completely drowned the television noise. Shortly afterwards, the noises began again, this time in a different part of the room. Scratching sounds and loud bangs seemed to come from the region of the priest hole beside the chimney and to proceed out into the room. They then moved towards and seemingly into a cabinet, then out again and across the floor with such power and force that a chair on which one of the investigators sat literally shook. The bangs traveled across the floor in front of the fireplace and then seemed to move outside the room in the region of the doorway. After a short pause, the bangs sounded yet again. This time they seemed to travel from the floor to the ceiling by way of one wall, and then across the ceiling where they ceased. The total duration of this exhibition was about 2 minutes. Soon afterwards, at 10:30 p.m., Knowles came into the room and asked whether anything had happened. When he was told about the very loud raps, he said nothing, but called on the name of Jesus Christ, and banged loudly 3 times on the cabinet with his hand, asking the spirit to answer him. Immediately 3 loud knocks came in reply, seemingly from within the room itself. A few more bangs were heard, and then the investigators left the house at 11:30 p.m. The second investigation, by the same 2 Ghost Club members, was on the 28th of July, 1979. They arrived at the house at 7 p.m. to find that a party of nurses and ambulance men from Preston were in the house on a sponsored ghost hunt. They decided to join the party. This time they had brought full recording apparatus and extension leads and were able to obtain a record of the whole proceedings. At 10 p.m. the bangs started, and again they seemed to move across the room. Various members of the assembled party were sitting on the floor, and they said they could feel the floor vibrate with the banging noises. One member became very cold, but the bangs were in no way as loud or as powerful as on the previous occasion. Later, Knowles came into the room, and a few more knocks were heard. The third investigating party consisted of the 2 previous Ghost Club members and 4 additional members. This was on September 1979 and lasted from 7 p.m. until 11:30 p.m. One member felt something invisible brush against her leg as she sat with her back to the wall facing the center of the room. A few knocks were heard, but of no real strength or duration, and only when Fred Knowles joined the party. This was easily the least eventful investigation. The fourth investigation took place on the 15th of August, 1980, and lasted all night from 7 p.m. until 5:30 a.m. the following morning. Again, the entire session was recorded. There was no unusual variation in temperature recordings, and the party consisted of 10 Ghost Club members and 2 mediums from the Northern Society for Psychical Research. A few light taps were heard, but nothing of great interest until Knowles joined the party just after midnight, when in direct answer to his request, loud and distinct knocks were heard on no less than 6 occasions. A recording machine just outside the room recorded no sounds whatever, so it would seem that the loud knocks were confined to the priest's room and were not heard outside the room. After Knowles left, one of the recordings, where he asked for his raps to be answered, was played back and a single rap responded to his recorded request. In 1983, manager Fred Knowles told me, "There is still plenty of noise phenomena. BBC Radio Lancashire recorded many bumps, bangs, and footsteps, and an apparition has briefly been seen entering the haunted bedroom. There have been numerous instances of cameras malfunctioning inside the house, and ghostly monks have appeared on instant snapshots taken on the south lawn." Late in 1983, a photograph was published in Amateur Photographer showing the apparently haunted corridor leading into the priest room. The picture was taken by Andrew Usher as he heard footsteps going towards the haunted room, and the microphone he was using, which can be seen in the picture, picked up the sound of the footsteps, but nothing unusual came out on film. Subsequently, Andrew told me that he became interested in such matters some 10 years previously after he had visited Salisbury Hall, and while there, attending a wedding reception, he caught a glimpse of a famous white lady ghost walking through the grounds. He decided that he would see whether he could discover more about spontaneous psychic phenomena. 2 years later, he met the late Mrs. Howarth, who allowed him to visit Chingle Hall repeatedly and conduct experiments there. He tells me, "The first night I went to Chingle, I was wondering what was going to happen. Fred Knowles introduced me to Michael Bingham at 7:30 p.m., and we all went upstairs. We sat in the corridor so that we could see down towards the stairs and towards the John Wall room. We had the light on in the priest room and the John Wall room, but no light in the corridor. We put orange bulbs in the sockets to counteract the harsh white light. About 8 p.m. I heard footsteps coming towards us from the stairs, sounding like shoes on a wooden floor, although the flooring was in fact carpeted. And I put my hand down towards the floor, holding the microphone there. The footsteps stopped just in front of my hand, and I felt icy fingers grasp my hand. I pulled myself free, and the footsteps then continued towards the John Wall room. Then they turned left, and into the airing cupboard, which it is believed was once an old doorway into the priest room. The footsteps entered the room, and then, for about half an hour, banging could be heard coming from a hide in the room. Very loud banging. And then all was quiet, and nothing more happened that night. 2 days later, I was in the porch when I heard footsteps coming across the stone bridge over the old moat, and as I reached the door and stepped into the porch, I prepared myself to bid good afternoon to a visitor. But there was nobody there. This happened several times, and once when I heard the footsteps, I saw a faint dark figure pass through the porch into the house. I followed immediately, but it quickly vanished. One night, about 6:45 p.m., I was looking through the window in the chapel, and I saw a monk dressed in brown, walking towards the drive, and I ran outside to meet it, but it had disappeared. Visitors to the house have also seen the ghost monk. The barn across from the house feels evil and depressing, a sensation that is shared by Fred Knowles, and I think something horrible must have happened there in the past which has left its mark. When Michael Bingham saw bricks being moved in the hide, I was a witness. I saw 4 black fingers pulling at a brick. I was filming with a sound cine camera at the time, and on the film you can hear the sounds, but the image is rather dark because I had to put the camera into the hide. We ran downstairs into the chapel and found several bricks scattered over the floor. I heard and saw things that I didn't believe were possible. I have seen and felt some strange things in other places, but never as much as at Chingle Hall. I hope the house will be investigated from top to bottom, as there is much to be found there. Not without cause, does Chingle have the reputation of being one of the most haunted places in Britain today. Clandon Park, West Clandon, Surrey. In 1896, over the signature X, Miss Ada Goodrich Freer contributed an article to the now-defunct Borderland magazine, quoting 2 continental publications and remarking that she had had the advantage of making inquiries on the spot on behalf of the Society for Psychical Research on the question of ghosts at Clandon Park. The stories circulating on the continent stated that a recent tenant of Clandon House had demanded the termination of his lease from the owner, Lord Onslow, because the place was rendered uninhabitable by the appearance of phantoms. Every night, it was stated, about 3 hours before dawn, the servants of Clandon House saw, advancing across the lawn surrounding the house, a lady dressed in a long robe of cream-colored satin and carrying a hunting knife in her hand. Several shots were fired by the keepers at this apparition, which disappeared into the castle, passing through the granite walls or through the massive oaken doors. One that more than 20 witnesses, most of them well worthy of belief, affirm that they have seen this lady in cream color, and had in vain opposed her progress in the house. Furthermore, it was specified that Lord Onslow himself and his solicitor had both seen the ghostly lady. And Lord Onslow had also seen 2 other phantoms, a young girl in black and a man with a long beard. Miss Freer pointed out that for the previous 5.5 years, a widow lady had been the tenant of Lord Onslow at Clandon Park. Earlier in the century, the fine old mansion had been untenanted, with the result that it had acquired, quote, on no evidence at present available, unquote, the reputation of being haunted. Yet, she goes on to say, quote, the servants of the present tenant and a few other persons have believed that they have seen figures about the house, but how far there is any evidence for this, unquote. Miss Freer also mentioned that Lord Onslow was at this time in Nice, and while she had made some inquiries, quote, the evidence so far obtained has not yet justified a formal report to the society, and any expression of opinion on the matter might, in the meanwhile, be justly regarded as premature, unquote. In a later issue of Borderland, Volume 4, 1897, Miss Freer wrote again about the ghost of Clandon House, and of her claim to have seen the apparition herself. She prefaces her article by saying that at that time details of the true story were already known to herself and other members of the SPR, quote, but as a matter of courtesy to the owner of the house, publication was deferred until permission had been received to make known the real circumstances, unquote. She went on to describe the case as, quote, a really good, well-attested ghost story, unquote, and says, quote, the traditions of haunting have been well known in the neighborhood for many years past, unquote, and at the suggestion of the vice president of the SPR, Lord Bute, she was invited to collect and examine all the evidence obtainable. She accordingly visited Clandon House in the company of Mr. G.P. Bitter, Q.C., a fellow member of the society, and they stayed overnight at the invitation of the occupants, Captain and Mrs. Blaine. But let Miss Freer tell the story herself, as she did at a meeting of the SPR at Westminster Town Hall on the 29th of January, 1897, with the president of the society, Sir William Crooks, O.M., F.R.S., in the chair. Once I get a breath. This is some good old Victorian, Edwardian writing, so buckle up. The evidence was not far to seek. It was abundant and varied in kind. We ascertained that the witnesses amounted to nearly a score. They were diverse as to age and class, adults and children, educated persons and servants. The evidence extended over a lengthened period and was in many cases especially definite and clear. At the time of my visit, I knew that the house had the reputation of being haunted. I knew absolutely nothing of any details. I arrived at the house in the dusk of an autumn day. We had tea cheerfully in the hall. The subject of the hauntings was mentioned, but I begged for evidential reasons that it might be dropped at once. Should any phenomena present themselves, I did not wish to have to discount more than was necessary for expectation. I was permitted to sit alone in the dark in 4 rooms alleged to be haunted, but entirely without success. I'm just imagining her sitting in these rooms alone in the dark with nothing happening. When I went up to dress for dinner, my hostess left me at the door of my room with a promise to send the maid. I followed her out a moment later to ask her to send an additional message as to something I wanted. Nothing else was for the moment in my consciousness. I ran in the direction from which she had come, but my hostess had disappeared, and I turned back towards my room. As I turned, I saw a lady coming towards me, perhaps 20 feet away. I stood for a moment, waiting for her to get nearer before deciding, I am slow-sighted, whether this really was my hostess. No, it was evidently someone who had come to dine. I had heard that guests were expected. She was cloaked and hooded. Her dress of yellowish-white satin gleamed where her cloak parted. She had jewels on the low bodice. The costume was quaint. The hood of the kind known to our great-grandmothers as a riding hood. I happen to possess one of the kind, about 120 years old, and the outline is quite familiar to me. She would be interesting and original, I reflected, and moved forward. Just as we met, when I could have touched her, she vanished. I discovered later that my description of her correspondence with that of other seers who have met the same figure before and since. It has to be stated that Miss Freer has recently been shown to be a most unsatisfactory psychic investigator, but the manifestations at Clandon House cannot be wholly attributed to her lack of objectivity. Clandon House was built about 1735 on the site of an earlier house. I don't know how many pictures I went through, so I was just so involved there. Clandon House was built about 1735 on the site of an earlier house by the Venetian architect Giacomo Leone. A porch to the front door was built in 1876, but otherwise the exterior is virtually unchanged, and the interior, too, with its magnificent plaster decoration, especially of the 2-story entrance hall, is basically unaltered. The house occupies an area which a charter of Henry III confirmed as being in the possession of the Knights Templar, and the home farm in the grounds is known as Temple Court, and is likely to have once been a grange of the Knights Templar. It was the second Baron Onslow who employed Leone to build the present house. He had married one of the richest heiresses of the day, Elizabeth Knight, a member of a well-known Jamaican family. Her portrait in the ground-floor Palladio room shows her to have been a dark girl with small pretty features, wearing a silvery dress. Some people have suggested that she seems to be looking that she seems to be looking shy and almost apologetic. This is interesting, for although she brought great wealth to Lord Thomas Onslow, she was considered to be socially a disadvantage. Old letters suggest that royal visitors were merely polite to the Lady of Clandon, preferring the company of more obviously noble ladies. There seems little doubt that she was a sad and lonely person, and legend has it that she drowned herself in the lake, and that it is her ghost that haunts the house. In the history of Clandon House, 1964, Pamela, Countess of Onslow, writes, "Legend has it that the heiress was unhappy, and it is said that her spirit still haunts the house that her riches built. There are stories of those who have caught a glimpse of the dark lady dressed in cream-colored satin, subsequently recognizing the figure they have seen from the portrait of the sad and lonely Lady Elizabeth Knight, who died in 1730, before the house had been built over the foundations." The 39 acres part covenanted to the National Trust were laid out by Capability Brown, the fashionable landscape gardener, who acquired that odd title from his habit of frequently remarking that such and such a piece of land was capable of improvement. There is an update for Clandon House. Since this book was written in 1984. The house, this is from Wikipedia. The house was badly damaged by fire in April 2015, probably caused by an electrical fault in the basement, leaving it essentially a shell with only one room, the speaker's parlor, intact. Thousands of historic artifacts, paintings, and items of furniture were lost in what has been described as a national tragedy. In January 2016, the National Trust announced that some of the principal rooms on the ground floor would be fully restored to the original 18th century designs, and upper floors will be used for exhibitions and events. Claydon House, Middle Claydon, Buckinghamshire. Buckinghamshire? Shear? Alright. Lindsay, Buckinghamshire. I first visited incomparable Claydon in 1962 at the invitation of the late Sir Harry Verney, whose family had owned land at Claydon since the 15th century. Claydon House was built by the second Lord Verney, and the present delightful edifice is part of what was intended to be a much larger house. With money made by his grandfather from trading with eastern countries after the Restoration, Lord Verney embarked on some ambitious building programs. At Claydon, he built first a brick stable block, and then altered and extended the existing house, which was altered again in 1860. His further plan was for a 250-foot west wing that included a ballroom and a hall with an observatory over it. Sadly, he ran out of money before the house was fully furnished. Some of his handiwork was pulled down by his niece when she inherited, and of Lord Verney's west wing only one block remains. Sir Harry Verney was full of stories of ghosts and ghostly happenings at Claydon, and he invited me to bring down a party of Ghost Club members, which I did as part of the club's centenary year celebrations. I shall always remember the welcome he and Lady Rachel gave us as they met us, took us into their gracious and beautiful and historic home. and Sir Harry began by recounting the ghost story of one of his ancestors, Sir Edmund Verney, Royalist standard-bearer who was killed in battle at Edgehill in 1642. According to this story, Sir Edmund had been captured by Cromwell's men, who demanded that he give up the colours, but Sir Edmund refused, saying, "My life is my own, but my standard is the king's." And so he was killed. But when the Roundheads tried to take the standard from his hand, they found they could not unlock his grip. So they cut off his hand. Later in the battle, the king recaptured the standard, Sir Edmund's hand still grasping it, recognized by the signet ring which bore the king's portrait. Sir Edmund's body was probably buried somewhere on the battlefield, no one knows where, but his hand was sent home to Claydon for burial. When the family vault was opened some years previously, Sir Harry Verney told us that there was no coffin for Sir Edmund, only a casket large enough to take a hand. In honor of our visit, Sir Harry brought out the treasured ring for us to see and handle. It is exquisitely beautiful. The present custodians at Claydon may tell you that this story is very sensational stuff, but Sir Harry Verney had no doubt about the matter, and he said that the ghost of Sir Edmund had long been reputed to haunt the present house, seemingly looking for his lost hand. Sir Harry told us that he had in his possession a number of signed and witnessed reports of sightings of the ghost of his ancestor. He was hoping to encounter the ghost himself one day. Among other reported ghosts at Claydon, Sir Harry told us about the experience of Mrs. Walker, a forester's wife who lived on the estate, a very reliable, truthful, and responsible woman who was at the house in 1923 looking after the children while everyone else was away. In the house at night time, she repeatedly heard the sound of very heavy footsteps, apparently emanating from the corridors near her. She knew there was no human being in the house apart from herself and the children, who were certainly not responsible. Time and again she noticed that the footsteps seemed to take the same path, and they always stopped at the trapdoor entrance to the priest's hole. Yet each time she investigated, no one was up there, and she discovered no explanation for the very distinct sounds. Years later, exactly the same sounds were heard by Mrs. Walker's sister, who hurriedly returned to her home, almost shaking with fright, after a night looking after her children and hearing the same heavy and unaccountable footsteps. Yet she had spent many nights in the house alone, and was completely familiar with the place. Her description of the sounds corresponded in every detail with the sounds heard by her sister, and very occasionally by other people who had no knowledge of these unexplained footsteps. There seemed to have been 2 secret hiding places at Claydon. One mentioned by a writer in order to compare it with a similar unusual priest hiding place and that once existed at Manchester Manor House in Warwickshire. It would seem to have been a staircase with a break halfway down where a man must let himself down several feet. Such a hide would be almost unique, my friend Glanville Squires told me. As an expert on secret hiding places, he informed me that a second hiding place was found at Claydon House in 1860 and destroyed by workmen who were carrying out the renovations, which inadvertently resulted in the discovery of the hiding place. This hide was arranged next to a chimney and concealed a false wall. It was said to have been large enough to take 10 men standing upright, but which hide was approached by the disembodied footsteps does not appear to have been established. Inside the house, we explored what the guidebook described as the most astounding Rococo suite of rooms in Britain, and the quite exceptionally fine staircase with its ironwork balustrade. This contains a continuous garland of ears of corn so delicately wrought that they rustle when anyone walks up the stairs. No ghost this, simply the remarkable work of a somewhat mysterious man named Lightfoot, about whom practically nothing is known except that he was extremely eccentric. Sir Harry told us about a ghostly figure thought to have been Lightfoot himself, that had been glimpsed in various shadowy parts of Claydon House. As appropriate to someone so named, his shade is seen, but no sound is heard. We were told that it could have been the ghost of Lightfoot that was seen during some demolition many years earlier. An estate carpenter had assisted in the destruction of the enormous ballroom and cupola, and while working among the rubble, he had chanced to look up and had seen a strangely dressed man standing nearby and looking at the devastation. When the carpenter called out to the figure, for he knew the stranger did not belong to the house, the figure suddenly and quite inexplicably disappeared. So, Sir Harry had also taken the trouble to obtain a written account of an apparition seen by his sister on the red staircase, and he remarked that this was probably the same apparition that other people had seen when staying at Claydon. Afterwards, he very kindly gave me his sister's account, and I cannot do better than quote verbatim. Written by Miss Ruth Verney, born 1879. It must have been about 1892, when I was 13, that I ran up the red stairs at Claydon House and turned left and left again on the first landing, and then took a few steps towards the cedar room. I noticed without surprise that a man was halfway down the upper floor. After I got nearly to the door of the rose room, I quite suddenly thought, but who was he? And I ran back to look. He was gone, and there hadn't been time for him to reach the top or the bottom of the flight. I saw him on the third step of the second flight, and he was coming down. He was tall and slender, and wore a long black cloak, beneath the hem of which peeped the tip of his sword. He carried a black hat with a white feather gracefully curled round the crown. That was all I saw. Mother said he was just where the secret stair had been. There was a curious little sequel, which may or may not have been merely a coincidence. Some time later, a little school friend was coming to spend a weekend. She was, of course, all agog to see the ghost, but in the interval we both forgot about him completely. We were going up to the top of the red stairs, and as she put her foot on the third step, she said, "By the by, where did you see that ghost? Alas, he has never come back. Other people have seen ghosts here and heard unaccountable noises. Andrew Lang, sleeping in what we used to call the Rose Room, was much honored to be awakened one night and to see a lovely lady in grey, but she quickly vanished into the wall of what had been a secret room." A ghostly lady in grey has reportedly been seen quite recently in a room habitually used by Florence Nightingale, who knew the house well, and one researcher has posed the question as to whether this could be the ghost of Miss Nightingale herself, but there seems no positive evidence for such an assumption. Most of the custodians at Claydon pour scorn on Miss Ruth Verney's ghost story. They point out that the red stairs, and for that matter the house as we know it today, did not exist in Cavalier days. So how can a ghostly cavalier haunt the red stair? But such logic cannot be applied to ghosts and ghostly phenomena. The ghost cavalier, if ghost it was, may have been appearing at the spot where it had appeared in life, irrespective of what may be there now. Or the ghost might be of a thought form projected from the mind of a living or dead person that is perceivable to some people. It cannot but be interesting to observe that according to Sir Harry, The same figure was seen in the same place nearly a century earlier. Among the legion of theories for ghosts is one that proposes that ghosts are some form of telepathic projection, possibly triggered by a traumatic event, and perhaps unconsciously fed by the presence of a certain type of person. If this were so, the present surroundings that a ghost might appear to be part of may be nothing whatever to do with the ghost or its appearance. There does seem to be good evidence for thinking that some ghosts are the product of the minds of the people who see them, and yet the same ghosts are seen again in the same place by other people who have no knowledge that such a ghost has been seen there. An entirely different theory suggests that certain events, under certain conditions, may be stored or preserved in some way in stones and brickwork, to be released when the requisite conditions prevail. Florence Nightingale frequently stayed at Claydon after her sister married Sir Henry Verney in 1858, and I have the lasting memory of having talked with Sir Harry Verney about the happy times he spent with the girl who was to become the much-loved Lady with the Lamp during the Crimea War. Many objects associated with her are preserved at Claydon, but as far as I know, her ghost has not been definitely recognized there, although she certainly haunts at least one other house she knew. But that would be another story. Clay Hill, Warminster, Wiltshire. This 800-foot-high chalk hill, with its Iron Age hill fort, is full of fascination and mystery. At the time of the Spanish Armada, Clay Hill was one of the heights which blazed with a warning beacon. Centuries earlier, it probably blazed with the fires of pagan festivals. More recently, there have been many reported sightings of unidentified flying objects from the top of this strangely shaped hill, and there are those who feel that the place is a center of psychic power. Until the early years of the present century, it was customary to fire the grass and gorse bushes on Clay Hill each Palm Sunday, ostensibly to drive out foxes and hares, or some claim to drive out the devil. It seems likely that the custom was a survival of a magical religious witchcraft or nature rite. Today, the National Trust frowns on fires being lit on Clay Hill, yet lights have sometimes been seen burning here at dead of night. Fires that apparently have no objective reality, since no trace is ever found of them next morning. On certain nights, the Ides of March and June, 31st October, and the 2nd of November are four. Local people and visitors have reported strange sights and sounds on Clay Hill. Dim figures silhouetted against the sky for a brief second before disappearing. The sound of muffled voices, high and singing and deep and primitive, has been heard, coming in waves and gone almost as soon as it is heard. But of course all this is pure imagination, has no reality outside the minds of those who hear it, has it? Clouds Hill, near Bovington, Dorset. This prim and whitewashed cottage, nestling amid rhododendron bushes, was fast becoming a ruin when T.E. Lawrence of Arabia, first rented it in 1923. He repaired and altered the ramshackle cottage, put in some simple furnishings, and spent much time here, dreaming, writing, reading, and listening to music on his ancient gramophone that is still in the pretentiously named music room. Here Lawrence revised the text of his monumental 7 Pillars of Wisdom, talked the night away, ate and drank, but only water or China tea. No alcohol ever entered Clouds Hill. He bought the place in 1925 as a home for his retirement, and had almost completed an extensive series of improvements when he left the Air Force in March 1935 and retired to Clouds Hill to live there for the rest of his life. In May, he wrote to Lady Astor, quote, "Nothing would take me away from Clouds Hill. It is an earthly paradise, and I am staying here." Unquote. 5 days later, on his way back to Clouds Hill from Bovington Camp, Lawrence had his fatal accident. By this time, there can be no shadow of doubt that Clouds Hill, as stated in the official guide, had become for him an earthly paradise, which he did not want to leave. And it would seem that part of him never has left the vicinity of Clouds Hill. When I visited Clouds Hill in 1970, I did so because Lawrence of Arabia had fascinated me for as long as I could remember, and because I had known men who had served with him. And I wanted to see the place where he had found some peace at the end of a troubled life. I was surprised to learn that stories of his ghostly form in Arab dress, usually entering Clouds Hill at dusk, had begun to circulate soon after his death, and that there had been irregular but persistent reports of the same figure being seen ever since. I also learned that the roar of a powerful motorcycle had been heard in the area of the accident at dead of night. A number of local people claim to have heard the throaty roar of a powerful brow superior coming towards them, often just before dawn. When the machine was still seemingly some distance from them, the noise of the motorcycle would cease abruptly. Some of the witnesses were people who remembered hearing Lawrence roaring along the lanes during his lifetime. Others were motorcycle fanatics who said there was no chance of their mistaking the unique sound of the brow superior, a machine that Lawrence possessed. A certain Mrs. Little of Eastbourne heard the sound in 1973, according to Andrew Green. I remember asking Lawrence's friend Knowles, who had built himself a bungalow nearby, on that initial visit, or possibly a subsequent one, about the ghostly associations, and he said it was all nonsense. And yet I wonder. A friend of mine who knew Lawrence well, and today treasures several souvenirs of his travels in Arabia, tells me that she has no doubt that Clouds Hill is haunted. Some years ago, she regularly visited the cottage, as she had done so often during Lawrence's lifetime, and she has repeatedly felt his presence there and sometimes caught a glimpse of his phantom form. Once, as she was leaving in the evening, she turned and saw him disappearing into the cottage, dressed in the Arab costume that he loved. Another time, when she was accompanied by a psychic friend, they both saw the ghost of Lawrence coming toward them, only to disappear when they could have almost touched him. They too have heard the roar in the roadway that has no objective reality. Perhaps that last journey that Lawrence took has somehow become impressed forever upon the atmosphere, and perhaps his love of the place has lived on and sometimes becomes crystallized into a visible form. At all events, it seems indisputable that the moving spirit of the Arab revolt is seen from time to time visiting again the little cottage that he loved, as he did so often during his lifetime. But in Arab costume? Perhaps that is how he most often thought of himself. Who knows?